Good morning. I'm Andy Johnson, the president of the Friends of the Bethel University Library. Welcome to Primetime at the Bethel University Library. Primetime is a collaborative project between the Friends of the Bethel University Library, faculty development, and many other offices on campus, which celebrates learning beyond the classroom through the experiences and accomplishments of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. I have the honor this morning of emceeing this year's Friends of the Bethel University Library Awards, the Connie J. Larson Memorial Scholarship, and the Library Research Prize. But first, we would like to say a couple of thank yous.
Although we did a special thank you last year at the Primetime birthday party, we would again like to thank Ann Gannon for her tireless work in coordinating all of the Primetime at the BU Library events, Bob Kistler for recording the event so they can be available on the Bethel University Digital Library, and to Jean Kenny, Randy Swanson, and other library staff who faithfully assist the setup and taking down of all the Primetime events. So thank you to all of you. So David is the official gift hander outer, so he's looking for And lastly, we would like to especially thank Eric Gossett. Eric, could you come up for a minute? Eric has been a longtime member and board member of the Friends of the Library, serving as president and vice president. He has written great book reviews for the newsletter and has been an all-around wonderful supporter of the organization. With his upcoming retirement, he'll be stepping down from Friends of the Library responsibilities, and we just wanted to take this time to say a special thank you. In 2009, the Friends of the Library organization established an annual $300 scholarship in memory of Connie J. Larson, reference librarian. In celebration, in commemoration of her service to the Bethel University Library and in celebration of her dedication to the training, supervision, and development of student library assistants. This scholarship is awarded each year to a student working in the Bethel University Library who exemplifies an attitude of service. The 2018-2019 recipient of the Connie J. Larson Memorial Scholarship Award is Lindsay Long. Now Lindsay's supervisor, Erica Ross, will share with you some of the reasons she was nominated and selected to receive this award.
Okay, so when we found out it was time to nominate a student worker, Caitlin Creason and I looked at each other and were like, Lindsay. So Lindsay is extremely reliable and dedicated to the library. It's hard to believe that she started out incredibly shy and overwhelmed, but once she felt confident with her role and knew all the policies and procedures, she quickly stood out from the rest of the team. In 2016, I promoted her to be a lead public services assistant because she's amazing and patient trainer, which is needed. She provides helpful customer service and is incredible with attention to detail. I love to brainstorm and bounce ideas around with her in order to improve our services at the front desk, and I know she's someone I could trust completely to act as my backup while I was on maternity leave last spring. This past summer, I was very stressed about having a new library system and how I was going to train a team of 35 student workers before school started. She continued to remind me that she and the other leads were here to help. She assisted with documenting new processes so that training would go quickly and smoothly, and I really couldn't have done it without her. Not only is she great at her job, she continues to contribute to this library in other creative ways. Lindsay helps lead the Library Student Council by keeping track of schedules, meetings, and finances. Yes. And she even agreed to sacrifice part of her spring break to stand next to me at a national library conference and co-present on her equipment collection. And then she did it a couple weeks ago too with Kaylin. So she's always willing to make time for our team and this library, even though she has an outrageous course load and other responsibilities. I can't think of anyone else more deserving than Lindsay.
Now we would like to present the Library Research Prize Award. The purpose of the prize is to promote undergraduate research throughout the curriculum and to encourage excellence in student research that makes substantial use of library resources and services and demonstrates an understanding of information literacy competencies. The winner of the 2018 Library Research Prize is Berit Turnquist. Berit will now share with us a presentation about her winning research process essay paper, followed by a time of questions. At 12:15, the Friends of the Library will hold their brief annual meeting, with an emphasis on brief. And we will elect officers, review the work of the past, and talk about plans for the future. So thank you.
Okay, hello. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, well, welcome. Thank you to everyone for coming. I'm really excited to share my research with you. I'm going to start off with a little bit of background about my topic, and then we'll jump in. So to start, I'd like to acknowledge the very first library resource that got the ball rolling, so to speak, by prompting me to choose a topic and focus the scope of my research. That first resource was Scott Kaihai and his visit to our senior SEM classroom last October. This was really the germination point for most of the research that I'll be talking about today. Up until the point of Scott's visit, I really didn't have a solid grasp on what I actually wanted to focus on or write about. In fact, up until that point, we had been doing a lot of really helpful foundational reading and conversation with Dr. Riesener, but I hadn't really had the chance to stop and consider what I was interested in researching for one, and more importantly, how I would refine that interest into a researchable topic. When Scott stopped into our classroom, he did two really helpful things. First, he invited all of us in the senior SEM to brainstorm out loud about what ideas we had and invited us to use him as a sounding board. He also gave us some really helpful tips for narrowing down our research and for making our process more efficient. For example, he taught us the power of using good keywords and for using the right research database for the specific type of resource that we were looking for. In the end, after a lot of brainstorming and guidance from both Scott and Dr. Riesener, I boiled down my inquiry to one key question, namely, where do women fit into the picture of Confucian sagehood, the Analects, and more broadly, the picture of Confucian ethics on the whole? So I'll begin to address this problem in a moment, but first a quick word about key terms. There are two main pieces of background information that I think I should go over quickly just to help your understanding of my topic before we jump in. The first piece of background is about the key text that I used for my comparative and cultural analysis. And the second is a cultural note regarding some of the gender dynamics at play in the background behind much of the other data and textual evidence that I used to conduct my research. The key text that I used is the Analects of Confucius, which was written around the 5th century BCE, supposedly comprised of sayings of Confucius himself, but transcribed or recorded by his disciples or followers. All of these sayings point to questions about what it means to be a good person and what a good or healthy society and government should look like. This text is considered to be the textual foundation for Confucianism and actually for much of Eastern philosophy in general. I just wanted to mention it because most of the quotes that I'll be reading later are drawn directly from one or more English translations of this text. The other key piece, I'm actually a slide behind, there we go. The other key piece of background information that I thought would be good for everybody to know about is the cultural concept of filial piety. And filial piety was Confucius's conception of a well-ordered and functional society built on respect-driven and hierarchical relationships between men and women, parents and children, siblings to siblings, friends, and then rulers and their subjects. If these relationships are correctly honored and observed, then Confucius argued society as a whole would flourish based on that foundation. So with those pieces of background in mind, let's move on to the first problem or the first question that I set out to address, namely, what exactly defines the Confucian scholar? What are the defining and essential traits that distinguish the Confucian Junzi from your regular everyday student? Unpacking this first question should help us later in determining whether women are included or excluded from the status of Junzi. So here's our first question. Before we can dive into any definition of sagehood and how and why it's different from the designation of Junzi, we'll have to first understand the defining characteristics of the Junzi, as I mentioned before. I'll read a few quotes from the Analects now that outline what the ideal Confucian scholar might look like. So here are a few key quotes. A scholar sets his heart on the way. If he's ashamed of his shabby clothes and coarse food, he's not worth listening to. Don't worry if you're without a position, worry lest you don't deserve a position. Don't worry if you're not famous, worry lest you don't deserve to be famous. The gentleman seeks virtue, a small man seeks land. The gentleman seeks justice while the small man seeks only favors. A gentleman considers what is just. A small man considers only what is expedient. Where there is no agitated attempt at thinking, I do not provide a clue. Where there is no stammered attempt at expression, I don't provide a prompt, said Confucius. If I raise one corner and don't receive the other three in response, I don't teach any further. And another English translation's version of that same quote. I enlighten only the enthusiastic and guide only the fervent. After I've lifted up one corner of a question, if the student can't discover the other three on their own, I don't repeat. Set your heart on the Dow. Base yourself in virtue, rely on Ren, and journey in the arts. Okay, so those are some quotes to keep in mind as we continue our discussion, but my main takeaway from that collection of passages can be synthesized as follows. The Confucian Junzi can really be anyone. Remember that some of the quotes that I just read implied that it doesn't matter if you're impoverished or a nobody off the street. What matters is the individual's state of mind. That is to say, it seems like the status of Junzi is open to everyone and anyone. That is, and as long as they are willing to work super hard, think and work independently, and pursue a rigorous course of study, which includes not only presumably lots of reading and thinking and deep conversations about morality and human nature, but cultivation of artistic and cultural mastery as well. These criteria will be important later, so keep them in mind. One really important thing to note at this point in the discussion is that this collection of key passages, while it does contain gendered language of gentleman and he in our English translation, it doesn't contain any explicit prohibition of women from the conception of the Junzi, but we will revisit that later on. So in regards to the library resources that I used for this section of my research, I wanted to say, first of all, that I could mention Scott and the other reference and research librarians for every single section in this presentation because of how helpful they all were to my research process. But instead of continuing to repeat their praises over and over, I'll start to focus more now on the specific articles, books, websites, and databases that aided in my research. So for elucidating the key traits that constitute a Confucian Junzi, I first used JSTOR, which is a research database, where I initially found an article about Confucius that I actually didn't end up including in my bibliography. But then I followed that article's citations to find Robert Eno's online teaching translation of the Analects. By the way, this trick of using the works cited page of other scholarly articles to find further resources is something that I learned from Scott Kai-Hai, I believe, in my Humanities 1 freshman year library research day. I've used it a lot in this paper and in all the rest of the papers that I've written throughout the 4 years that I've been here. It's turned out to be a really helpful trick. The importance or purpose of specifically using Robert Eno's teaching translation of the Analects is that it was really helpful for comparing to Simon Lay's English translation of the Analects. So comparing the two different English translations was interesting for parsing what it means to be a Junzi with greater nuance, and for being able to identify and grasp onto slivers of truth and greater understanding by examining the differences and intersections between two good but very different English translations. So moving on to problem number 2. The second problem that I set out to address was the curious matter of the apparent differences between the Confucian Junzi and that of the Confucian sage. The conception of, or the concept of the Confucian sage is frequently the subject of scholarship about Confucius or about Confucian ethics, but the word sage is rarely mentioned in the actual text of the Analects. Instead, we see the words gentleman or scholar or wise man repeated in Confucius's instructions for moral living, as we just saw in the quotes that I read a minute ago. Now that we've unpacked, at least very briefly, what defines the Confucian Junzi in the previous section, I think now would be a good time to explore what the central characteristics or the essence of the sage are. This question was particularly inspired by my reading of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Confucianism, which was another early library resource that I found while poking around on the Bethel Library's Research Guides webpage. I personally have found it really helpful to peruse the research databases list organized by subject, as this has helped point me in the direction of some generally helpful research databases and search engines, as well as subject-specific databases, like, for example, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a great resource for reliable, concise background information and for sparking initial questions that might guide or focus later research. So moving on, let's look a little more closely at this idea of the sage in Confucian ethics. At this point, we've made some progress in defining exactly what the Confucian Junzi or scholar is, but the question still remains, what is a sage? The definition of sage that I ended up working with during the process of writing this paper can be summarized pretty neatly by Wang Yangming, a Neo-Confucian scholar who lived and wrote in the Ming Dynasty. Wang Yangming's quote about sagehood reads as follows. Quote, "The reason the sage has become a sage is that his mind has become completely identified with universal coherence and is no longer mixed with any impurity of selfish human desires." I'm going to read that quote one more time. "The reason the sage has become a sage is that his mind has become completely identified with universal coherence and is no longer mixed with any impurity of selfish human desires." That's a pretty interesting statement. From this quote, we can say that sagehood is kind of hard to pin down or fully define. But from Wang Yangming's quote, we can see that it's something fully actualized, transcendent, and defined by utter and complete moral purity. There are a lot of other quotes and resources that I could acknowledge here to further illustrate the concept of sagehood in the Confucian framework, but I think the most important kernel to take away is that sagehood, unlike the status of Junzi, seems to be somewhat more ephemeral and aspirational, perhaps even for most people unattainable. It seems that it can't be conferred upon any person, either male or female, by any institution or government. It's transcendent and deeply personal. As for the relationship between Junzi and sagehood, I will argue that the designation of Junzi can be conceptualized as something like a definable milestone along the path to an aspirational ideal of sagehood. So sagehood is the ultimate goal, but I think most Confucian scholars would likely have called themselves students or Junzi of the way of sagehood and likely wouldn't have called themselves sages. So the first resource that I used for coming to this particular resolution of the question was Stephen Engel's Sagehood, The Contemporary Significance of Neo-Confucian Philosophy. I won't go into a ton of detail about this book for now. It was incredibly helpful for my research, but I borrowed it from Dr. Riesener and didn't come by it through any of the library's avenues. That being said, at this point I will give another plug to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which again I found as a result of the Bethel Library's Research Guides page, for not only giving a concise and helpful description of Wang Yangming's philosophy on sagehood, but also included a lot of helpful quotes and well-translated passages, which I used to then clarify my research. So at this point, we're going to shift our conversation to bring the element of gender into the picture. Let's look at problem number 3. The third and final question that I set out to address and that ultimately ended up shaping my research was the question of where do women fit into this picture and all of these definitions and Confucian admonitions. We've already explored in brief terms the significant differences between the Junzi and the sage, and have discussed some of the traits and actions required for becoming a Junzi, but the question that still remains is why aren't women addressed, and are women at least theoretically and philosophically included in the Confucian definition of sagehood? So spoiler alert, I argue in some depth in my paper that the exclusion of women in the pertinent texts is an exclusion based on the practicalities of filial piety and women's roles in the 5th century BCE, not an essential exclusion based on female moral deficiency. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'll just start by laying out a few of the cultural and historical expectations placed on women during the time when the Analects were recorded, to argue that it might have been impractical and perhaps even impossible for a vast majority of the female population to pursue the status of Junzi. So for one, women got married super young during this time for a variety of cultural reasons, including high rates of female infanticide, polyamory in the aristocracy, and the expectation that women were typically supposed to start a family as soon as possible, sometimes as young as 13 or 14 years old. Women's education also stopped or dropped off significantly at a much earlier age than that of their male counterparts, and wouldn't have included or encouraged the same type of applied scholarship that might have been encouraged or promoted for young men. In fact, most education for women during this time was centered around homemaking, not strict academic pursuits like scholarly reading or writing. This point is very important. Remember when we talked earlier about how the ideal Confucian disciple was supposed to be an eager student, someone who could manage sustained self-reflection and independent study, along with holding up their end of a close student-teacher relationship? Well, besides the fact that it would have been generally frowned on for women to spend time with any men outside of their immediate family, the idea of a woman, especially a woman who was not part of the aristocracy, having sufficient time or resources to commit to a strenuous course of independent study would have been virtually unheard of. Because of the cultural expectation that women would grow up to be good wives and nurturing mothers and not much else, and because they were extremely limited in their education, it would have been extraordinarily unlikely that most women would even have had, 1, the time, 2, the ability to work or study outside the home, or 3, the support or approval from family and community members to be able to make the steep commitment required of individuals who desired to pursue the status of Junzi. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge that there were likely very many intelligent, curious, hardworking, and studious women in the time when the Analects were recorded. All of this is just to say that even the most intelligent and academically minded women would have been without the same systemic and cultural support available to their male counterparts, thus making it impractical for them to pursue the status of Junzi in the same way. This was kind of a fun question to address in terms of research because this section of my paper definitely made the most heavy use of library resources, and because of that I felt like I learned a lot. We had an article by Sung Moon Kim called The Way to Become a Female Sage in Yoon Ji-dang's Confucian Feminism, which I found through the Journal of the History of Ideas. Joseph A. Adler's Daughter, Wife, Mother, or Sage/Immortal Bodhisattva, Women in the Teaching of Chinese Religions, which I found through Asia Network Exchange. Wang Li's Women's Education in Traditional and Modern China from the journal Women's History Review. And then actually an entry in the National Institute of Health Archives by Di Zhang called Changes of Marriage Age in Ancient China. All of these sources helped or guided my research in different ways, but they all stemmed directly from the BU Library's databases, namely JSTOR, EBSCOhost, Humanities Source, and the National Institute of Health webpage. That is to say, all of these sources lay at the end of a digital journey of clicking and searching that began with a simple visit to the Bethel Library's webpage. I think it's worth mentioning as well that all of these resources facilitated a particularly important part of my research, namely the part of my research process where I started to gather the actual data or existing scholarship that I required to make a robust argument. Before I found these resources, my argument was really more of a close reading of the Analects mixed with some of my own conjecture about women's roles in ancient Chinese culture. But after I found the sources that I mentioned before, I was able to unite the Analects with some concise cultural data and excellent scholarship to really bring the argument to where it is today. So one final resource that I'd really like to highlight before we end is the article and adjacent set of facsimiles compiled by Zhang Mingqi called The 4 Books for Women, Ancient Chinese Texts for the Education of Women. This resource led me to a really interesting discovery, which I think highlights the sometimes hidden or overlooked role of women in Confucian history and in history in general. The 4 books for women were written over the span of 2 dynasties, namely the Ming and Qing, by, and I apologize in advance for butchering these names, Empress Wu, Song Ruxin, Lady Lu, Banzhou, and Song Ruzhou. Feel free to correct me on pronunciation later. Before we go any further, I just need to fangirl for a second because this group of women, besides being all women contributors, included a poet, an author, 2 courtiers, the first known Chinese female historian and philosopher, and an empress. So this was a pretty dynamic and cultured and awesome group of ladies, and each one of them definitely deserves their entire research paper and presentation, but I digress. I just really thought that that was worth acknowledging. This collection of books, besides being an amazing testament to female contributions to the Chinese canon of historical and philosophical scholarship, is also arguably one of the earliest examples of a female-led and female-focused conceptualization of sagehood. The 4 books for women, with the title in itself referencing the original 4 books of Confucian scholarship, aligned itself and its content with the legendary Confucian scholarship found in the Analects and its companion texts, while also appropriating the title of a traditionally male-centered and male-dominated set of works. As for the content of the 4 books for women, there's a little bit of everything, but for the most part, it combines applied ethical and philosophical inquiry with some instruction on domestic propriety, and the Dow of Women. The use of the word Dow here is very important. Remember when we looked at those quotes from the Analects? Well, one of the things that Confucius supposedly told his followers to cultivate is Dow, which can be translated roughly, according to Robert Eno's teaching translation of the Analects, as, quote, the Confucian notion of the evolved moral and cultural pattern of past eras of sage governance. Dow is also a generic term for any fully conceived behavioral path, end quote. In the context of the Analects and much of other later Neo-Confucian writings, Tao was conceptualized as the focused behavioral pursuit of self-cultivation and moral coherence, which, as we already discussed, probably was pretty much only possible for men during the time when the Analects were written. In writing the 4 books for women and conceptualizing the content of the 4 books for women as a form of Tao, Empress Wu and the other contributors facilitated a really important cultural and intellectual shift. In writing this work and formulating a robust definition and conception of the women's way or women's Tao, so to speak, Empress Wu and the rest of the contributors to the 4 books for women implicitly argued that what women were already doing and what women were already expected to do was not only compatible with the Confucian notion of sagehood, but might even constitute a form of sagehood only achievable by women. I think that's pretty remarkable. I think this just goes to show that smart, articulate, and strong-willed and vibrant-minded women have always existed, and that women likely have always been, at least theoretically, able to pursue the ideal of sagehood or achieve the status of Junzi. It just took the work and writing of some incredibly innovative and brilliant women like Empress Wu, Banzhou, Song Ruxin, and many others to put sagehood in a framework that was not only accessible to women, but that also celebrated the unique abilities and moral perspectives that women could bring to the discussion of Confucian ethics and sagehood. So for the purposes of time, I won't spend any more of this time talking about the content of my paper or the countless other ways that my process was improved and strengthened through the library's resources, although I'd be happy to discuss further with anyone later. So with that, I think I can open up the floor for questions. Thank you. Yes.
In your paper, you talked about this Korean scholar who ended up widowed and rich and had the luxury. Can you say a little bit more about how that afforded her the opportunity to become a scholar?
Yeah, so Dr. Gossett's question was about something in my paper that I didn't explicitly mention in my presentation, and just asking to talk a little bit more about the Korean scholar Im Yoon-ji-dang, who I'm really glad you brought her up because she's awesome and has a really interesting story. So Im Yoon-ji-dang was an 18th century scholar who, through kind of a tragic set of family and interpersonal circumstances, ended up widowed, orphaned, and all her children died. So she had no children, no husband, no parents, which, although extremely tragic, also freed her from the traditional constraints of the kind of the familial constraints of filial piety. So she was able to pursue a course of scholarship and devote a lot of time to study that a lot of women in her same time period wouldn't have been able to achieve. So she actually was one of the first women to actually identify herself as a student or a pursuer of the Confucian ideal of sagehood. And she wrote some really beautiful analect-esque poetry that I could find later. I don't have any of it memorized, sadly, but that kind of conceptualized sagehood as something that was not so gendered as it was in the original Analects of Confucius. So I think in Yunjidang is kind of a cool example of what maybe theoretically could be possible for women who would like to pursue Confucian sagehood, who weren't fettered by the same filial constraints that most other women were. So, good question. Thank you. Yes?
Do you have any sense of what the status of this is today in China?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, Dr. Turnquist's question was...
I could ask you later, too. So.
Was whether I know what the current status of this whole debate is in China. And that was actually something that I was looking at close to the end of senior sem. I found an article, which obviously now the name and the author are failing me, but that was getting into a really interesting analysis of whether kind of these more feminist or gender studies type lenses can ever fully be integrated into an Eastern culture that's so deeply entrenched with and influenced by the ideals of filial piety. Because after all, Confucius's ideal of filial piety, I didn't go into this a ton in my paper, but that was like very foundational for the entire culture at that time and really built a lot of the kind of mores and norms that we see in Eastern culture today thousands of years ago. So the article that I read kind of made it sound like the status right now is that there are more contemporary scholars, specifically female scholars, who are at this point trying to find some way to reconcile the still deeply filial piety influenced culture in China and other Eastern cultures with the inherently and necessarily feminist implications of trying to bring women into a picture of Confucian sagehood. So I guess I would say the status of it now, to answer your question more directly, is that there's a lot of discussion around it, but that things aren't moving very quickly. Yes, Dr. Shady.
In your conclusion, when you talked about the 4 books for women and mentioned that there was the potential for women to, in some ways, have a unique path to sagehood or Junzi, is that more in the idea of the roles that women play as wife and mother is its own unique path, or is that more in terms of an idea of certain traits that women have? Could you say more about what was focused on there?
Yes. So Dr. Shady's question was if I can just explain a little bit more in detail what specifically like the Dow of Women would have looked like as conceptualized by the 4 books for women, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I think it was a combination of a couple different things. So I didn't include this in my presentation, but some of the titles of the sections of the 4 books for women are, let me see if I can remember or paraphrase some of them. Like one of them was Instruction for Women in the Ways of Sages Past, or like Instruction for Women in Moral Growth or Tending Your Moral Self. So there were definitely, I think, some really strictly philosophical essays that were written by a number of the contributors that kind of said, like, hey, women, minus all of this like gendered language and like gendered implications of the Confucian gentleman and the Confucian scholar, here's a philosophically robust ideal of sagehood or Junzi that you can pursue that I think, to my understanding, was conceptualized more so that it would fit with the duties and time-consuming familial expectations that they would have had. But a few of the essays also talked about domestic life in a framework that was much more than domestic and instead painted the woman's domestic roles or responsibilities as a form of Tao in itself. Because like Robert Eno said in his teaching translation, the Tao is any fully conceived behavioral path. So I think it would be probably a little bit out there to say that just being a homemaker or just being a woman who knows how to read like automatically makes you a Junzi. I don't think that's what the 4 Books for Women was intending to argue, but I do think that writing some of those essays that painted domestic life as theoretically like a pathway into Tao or a pathway into a lifestyle that was compatible with pursuing Confucian sagehood was definitely an aspect of it. So I think it was both in the woman-oriented philosophical essays and in the conceptualization of domestic responsibilities as potentially a form of Tao. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Can you talk more about your writing and research process, especially
Sure.
the relationship between research and writing?
Yeah. So you're Berit Fisher, right? Yes. Okay. So Berit's question was.
I spelled it the other way.
Yes. So his question was if I can just talk more about my actual research process and the relationship between research and writing. So for this paper, I think my research and writing process was kind of defined by frustration at first because since my topic is not Western philosophy based, I honestly had a lot of trouble at first with just searching like Confucianism or like Confucian ethics into JSTOR or EBSCOhost. Because at first it would mostly just be coming up with articles, kind of almost like reflective articles about Confucian like meditation, which is still valuable and interesting but not really applicable to my topic. So in the very first stages of researching, I was hitting a lot of walls with not understanding how to actually find the resources. You know when you like know there's a resource out there and you kind of can picture what it would say or like what kinds of arguments it would have in it, but I just wasn't able to find that. So what really helped was first trying to use different keywords. So I tried to use some different keywords, and Dr. Reasoner and Scott's visit to our classroom helped with that. But what I actually also found weirdly helpful is like going to either Wikipedia or Google Scholar or Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, some of those more like really basic resources, and then using like those attached keywords or some of the concepts in those articles to then plug into the advanced search in JSTOR, or even, like I said before, scroll down to their works cited and just follow their research path until I found what I was looking for. So I think initially with the research, it was a much more complex process than it had been for other papers, which made the writing also kind of interesting. It was a more intuitive and step-by-step writing process than I've experienced in the past. Because I think for a lot of the other papers that I've been required to write, I kind of already know what like my full argument is going to be, especially if you're writing about something in the Western canon where you might be more familiar with it just from high school or from multiple different history of philosophy survey classes. I was able in the past to kind of lay out my argument ahead of time, and for this paper, because of the unfamiliar nature of the philosophy and because of the kind of unfamiliar research process, I was forced to stop at each step of the way and rethink my argument with basically every single new concept that I was coming up against. So I guess, does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you. Yes, Scott.
I was curious if you felt like you could go as deep as you wanted to with your research, or if you started hitting walls with like language barrier where you weren't able to find things that were translated adequately, or
Yeah.
I mean you addressed that a little bit with Berit's question just now, but do you feel like you got the understanding of your topic you wanted to and were satisfied with, or was there more to get to and you just couldn't because of the, like you said, the cross-cultural nature of your question?
That's a good question. So Scott's question was whether I feel like I have gotten as deep as I would like with my paper, or if I kind of feel like I've gotten as deep as I can based on my language limitations and the limitations of my ability to do research in that area of philosophy. Is that kind of what you were asking? Okay. I think the simple answer to that is no. I think I would like to have been able to go deeper. I mean, even I remember once in class we were talking about this idea of Ren over and over and over and over, which we were kind of roughly translating as humanity or like humaneness. I think I'm remembering that correctly. And one of the other students in our senior sem had a background in Chinese, and then at some point explained that Ren, the symbol or the Chinese character for it, actually is heart plus tree, which brings a whole new layer of richness and complexity to that term that just humaneness or just Ren can't capture. And I think that little moment in time sort of captured my lingering frustrations with this topic. Not necessarily negative frustrations, but just frustrations with my own limitations because I don't speak Chinese, have no background in it whatsoever. And it's just amazing to think about how much deeper this topic could have gone or how much more complex my research could have become if I had a background in Chinese language, or even if I had taken more than just Asian philosophy and then jumped right into senior sem. So I would say the very positive side to that, though, is that this process of realizing how little I really know and how relatively shallow my research was at the end, I'm not discouraged by it because I actually now have a lot of continuing questions about this same topic or stemming from this same topic that I will likely pursue later. So it was both a frustrating thing and also a fruitful thing, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question? Yes?
I had a question, Berit. Did you encounter any comparative works that compared, say, Confucian ideas of sagehood and gender, let's say Mohist or Taoist or other Chinese systems of thought?
Yeah, so Andy's question was whether I encountered any comparative works that posited the thoughts and ideas of the Analects and the Confucian, strictly Confucian philosophy with like Mohist or Taoist. And the answer is yes, but I don't have very much experience looking at those comparative works side by side, except from in our philosophy senior sem, the structure of it was we would kind of look at different schools of thought, including Confucianism and then looking at Neo-Confucian scholars. So I'd say my experience with comparative works or comparing different works in Eastern philosophy has been more in the realm of Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism. So comparing Confucius's works to later Neo-Confucian scholars. And no, I don't think, I would love to learn more, but I don't think I have a ton of...
It sounds like there aren't major works out there that compare Confucian ideas with Mohist and so on this particular topic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's probably some out there that do compare this specific topic, but I'm not familiar with them necessarily. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.